When I was 14, my parents bought a new house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple two-story home with a basement. My bedroom was on the second floor, right at the end of the hallway, and it had a big window that faced the backyard. I loved that room. It was my little sanctuary. That was until I started waking up in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe it was just a phase. Maybe I was having bad dreams I couldn't remember. But as the nights went on, I started noticing strange things. Some nights, my closet door would be open when I distinctly remembered closing it before bed. Other times, I'd hear faint creaking sounds, like the wooden floorboards shifting. But I'd always convince myself it was just the house settling. One night, I even swore I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate, almost like someone trying to keep quiet. But whenever I sat up and listened, the sound would disappear. Then one evening, I was home alone. My parents had gone out for dinner, and I decided to stay in and play video games in my room. I had my headphones on, fully immersed, when I suddenly felt this strange sensation, like I wasn't alone. My skin prickled. I pulled off my headphones and listened. Nothing. The house was silent except for the occasional ticking of the clock on my wall. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a thump from the basement. My stomach twisted. The basement door was always kept shut, and no one was supposed to be home. I slowly crept out of my room and tiptoed down the stairs. The basement door was slightly ajar. That wasn't right. I knew for a fact it had been closed earlier. My heart pounded as I debated what to do. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe I hadn't shut it all the way. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Gripping my phone, I took a deep breath and pushed the door open wider. The basement light was already on. I stared down into the dimly lit space. Everything looked normal. The old couch, the storage boxes, the laundry machines. But then I noticed something. A blanket was crumpled on the floor near the farthest corner, and next to it was an empty water bottle. My breath caught in my throat. That hadn't been there before. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. My first instinct was to run, but some irrational part of me needed confirmation. I stepped down, 1 foot at a time, my pulse hammering in my ears. As I got closer, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. A footprint, a dirty, smudged footprint on the cold cement floor, leading toward the crawl space under the stairs. That was enough for me. I bolted back upstairs, locked my bedroom door, and called my dad. My parents rushed home, and my dad, trying to act tough, grabbed a bat and went to check the basement. My mom stayed with me, her arm around my shoulders, telling me everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. When my dad came back upstairs, his face was pale. He didn't say much, just locked all the doors and windows and told us to stay together for the night. The next morning, he installed a new deadbolt on the basement door. He told me later that he had found more than just a blanket and a water bottle down there. He had found food wrappers, empty chip bags, and worst of all, a small folded-up mattress tucked behind the storage shelves. Someone had been living in our basement. For how long, we didn't know. My parents called the police, but by the time they searched the basement, whoever had been staying there was gone. They said it was likely a homeless person who had snuck in before we moved in and had been secretly living there ever since. But what terrified me the most wasn't that someone had been there. It was the thought that every night when I woke up, for no reason, maybe I had woken up because I wasn't alone. The winter of 1943 was merciless. The snow in the Belarusian forests stretched endlessly, burying the dead and swallowing the echoes of war. It was the kind of cold that settled deep in the bones, numbing both body and soul. My grandfather, a Soviet soldier at the time, recounted this story only once. He never liked speaking of the war, but when he did, there was always a distant, haunted look in his eyes. It happened shortly after a brutal engagement with German forces. His unit, battered but victorious, had taken refuge in an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of a ruined village. The building still stood, miraculously untouched by artillery fire. Inside, the soldiers huddled together, their breath visible in the dim candlelight. Some sang softly, others played cards, but most simply sat in exhausted silence, sipping from stolen bottles of vodka. Late into the night, a scout burst through the door, his face pale with terror. He claimed to have heard something in the woods, something unnatural. At first, the men laughed it off. Paranoia was common, especially after the horrors they had seen. But then came the sound. A low, guttural moan drifted through the trees, deep and resonant, like the earth itself groaning in agony. The laughter died instantly. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The moaning came again, closer this time, long and drawn out, like something suffering. My grandfather's comrade, Victor, clenched his rifle and muttered something about wolves, but they all knew it wasn't that. No wolf ever made a sound like that. The lieutenant ordered a small group, including my grandfather, to investigate. Wrapping themselves in thick coats, they stepped out into the bitter night. The forest loomed around them, shadows stretching unnaturally under the moonlight. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they moved toward the source of the noise. They found the first body near the edge of the trees, a German soldier. He was on his knees, frozen in place, his face twisted in an expression of unspeakable horror. His rifle lay at his side, untouched. The strangest thing was his throat. It wasn't cut, nor was it riddled with bullets. It was crushed, as if something massive had wrapped around his neck and squeezed until the life drained from his body. One of the men cursed under his breath, and another muttered about wild animals. But then they saw the second body. This one was worse. Much worse. The soldier had been torn apart. His torso was split open, his ribs bent outward as if something had clawed its way inside him. His eyes were gone. His uniform was shredded, the flesh underneath marred with deep, jagged wounds. The snow beneath him was soaked black with his blood. A snap of a branch made them all whirl around, rifles raised. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, from the darkness, something moved. A shape, tall and thin, almost human but wrong. Its arms were too long, its movements unnatural. The moaning sound returned, reverberating through the trees, rising into a shriek. One of the soldiers opened fire, the muzzle flash illuminating the nightmare before them. It had no eyes, just a stretched, gaping maw lined with needle-like teeth. Its flesh was pale, almost translucent, and it moved with an unnatural speed, darting between the trees as bullets tore into the night. "Run!" someone shouted. They didn't need to be told twice. They turned and sprinted back toward the farmhouse, adrenaline overriding the biting cold. Behind them, the thing followed, its breath ragged and wet, its footfalls unnervingly quiet for something so large. My grandfather swore he could feel it right behind him, reaching out, its long fingers inches from his neck. The farmhouse was in sight. The soldiers on watch, seeing the panic in their comrades' eyes, raised their weapons and opened fire into the trees. The thing let out a piercing screech, so loud, so inhuman, it made their ears ring. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The forest fell silent once more. They barricaded the doors, sat with their backs to the walls, guns clutched tightly in trembling hands. No one spoke. No one dared to sleep. Morning came slowly, the sun casting long shadows across the snow, revealing no tracks where the creature had been. No trace of its passing, save for the corpses left in its wake. When the lieutenant reported the incident, he was met with blank stares and dismissive waves. The war had no room for ghosts and monsters. There was only the enemy, only the fight. But my grandfather knew. He saw it, he heard it. And even in his final years, when he struggled to recall the faces of his old comrades, he never forgot the thing in the woods. When my fiancée and I moved into our new house, we were excited for a fresh start. It was a cozy place in a quiet town, just what we had been looking for. The house had a spacious backyard, perfect for summer nights. And though our neighbors were spread out, we met an elderly couple next door who seemed nice enough. A couple of weeks into living there, we were still settling in. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, my fiancée was in the kitchen cooking dinner while I sat at the dining table scrolling through my laptop. It was a bit warm inside, so I decided to slide open the back door for some fresh air. As I reached for the handle, my heart nearly stopped. Someone was sitting in one of the chairs on our back patio. He was hunched over, his head tilted downward as if he were asleep. At first, I thought maybe he was a friend of one of the neighbors who had wandered over by mistake. But as I looked closer, something about him felt wrong. I whispered to my fiancée not to scream and told her there was a man outside. She froze, eyes wide, before stepping closer to get a look. The moment she saw him, she grabbed my arm, whispering frantically, asking who he was and what we should do. I had no idea. She wanted me to say something, but I hesitated. He was larger than me, broad-shouldered with a thick, graying beard and tattoos running down his arms. There was something unsettling about the way he sat, unmoving, as if he was waiting for something. Finally, I knocked on the glass door and called out, "Hey, can I help you?" "You need to leave." The man stirred, then turned his head toward us. A slow, eerie smile crept across his face, like he was amused. Then, without a word, he stood up and walked toward the door. I instinctively checked the lock, my breath catching in my throat. Standing just on the other side of the glass, he stared at us. Then he shifted his gaze to my fiancée. His lips parted, and he started whispering vile, disgusting things that made my skin crawl. I yelled, "I'm calling the police." But he didn't flinch. Instead, he ran his tongue across his lips and chuckled, a sickening, raspy sound. My fiancée backed away, gripping my arm. I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911, explaining in a hushed but urgent voice that there was a man in our backyard harassing us. While I was on the phone, he suddenly stepped back into the darkness of the yard. I could barely see his silhouette as he walked toward the trees at the far end of the property. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. They searched the area but found nothing. They took a report and told us to call again if he returned. We thought that was the end of it. Hours later, as we sat in the living room trying to shake off the fear, we heard something from outside. A faint rustling, then a soft tapping sound. My fiancé looked at me with wide eyes. I crept toward the window and carefully peeled back the blinds. He was there, standing in the yard, staring at the house. A cigarette dangled from his fingers, his head slightly tilted. And then, as if sensing my gaze, he turned his head sharply toward me. I let go of the blinds and stepped back, heart hammering in my chest. A moment later, a loud bang rattled the window. He was pounding on the glass, screaming obscenities, describing in disturbing detail the things he wanted to do to my fiancée. She screamed, running upstairs while I grabbed my phone again, my hands shaking as I dialed 911 a second time. I shouted that the man was back and trying to get into the house. As I spoke, the pounding stopped. I waited, listening, before daring to check the window again. He was gone. A second later, I heard the back doorknob rattling. He was trying to get inside. I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find and stood by the door, my breath shallow. My fiancée was upstairs, barricading herself in the bedroom. I could still hear him murmuring outside, low and slurred, like he was talking to himself. Then, just as suddenly as it started, The noises stopped. The police arrived minutes later, but by then, the yard was empty again. They searched the property and surrounding area but found nothing. I told them about the things he had said, the way he acted. The officers were concerned but said that without video evidence or physical proof of a crime, there wasn't much they could do other than patrol the area. The next day, we decided to ask around the neighborhood to see if anyone knew him. One couple down the street did. Their faces darkened when we described him. "He's trouble," they said. "Drinks too much, gets violent. He used to live with his wife a few streets over. She left after he started hitting her. He's been a problem ever since." They told us he still lived nearby in a rundown house just around the block. We reported everything to the police again, but without solid evidence, they couldn't do much. Just a short walk from our home. For weeks, we barely slept, jumping at every little sound. But he never came back. Eventually, life returned to normal, and we tried to put it behind us. But every now and then, I catch myself looking out the window at night, just in case, because we never found out why he was here that night. And I still don't know if he's waiting to come back,